proud that the DevOps Enterprise Summit has become the best learning event for technology leaders, helping them achieve their goals and their organizations win in the marketplace. I am more excited than ever about the high learning and high networking event that we're creating for you, which I know will be an incredibly valuable and fun way to learn, so different than the endless video conference calls we've all been stuck in for months. The excitement I feel right now must be how a movie director feels when they're sitting on a guaranteed blockbuster, but only a few people have seen because the release date is still weeks away. We put together a trailer to show you just how amazing the talks are. So in this video, you'll see two amazing talks that I've selected from the over 60 talks and 70 speakers who will be presenting at DevOps Enterprise Summit. First, you'll hear selected excerpts from the talk from the team from Swiss Re, the world's largest insurance and reinsurance company founded in the year 1863. Victoria Mayo is head of compliance for iptiQ EMEA Property and Casualty, and she is co-presenting with James Head, who is her counterpart as the interim head of delivery and also CEO of Rebellion Consulting. And after that, you'll see a couple of excerpts from David Silverman, co-author of Team of Teams and founder and CEO of CrossLead. Mr. Silverman spent 13 years as a U.S. Navy SEAL, leaving as a lieutenant commander. He describes the incredible story of why, in 2004, the Joint Special Forces Task Force was failing to achieve its mission to dismantle al-Qaeda in Iraq and what they did about it. Their work led to not only them achieving their strategic objectives, but also led to a deep and critical rethinking of almost everything across all U.S. military services and in commercial industry as well. Everything he talks about, I know will resonate deeply with the DevOps Enterprise community. If you want to see these talks right away, the only way you can get them is by registering. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy their amazing presentations.
So iptiQ took the spirit of an agile tribe and created the control tribe. So that was made up of the various Swiss Re governance functions like compliance, legal, data protection, information security. And this tribe was really about educating those people whose day job was simply not iptiQ, unlike myself. And that control tribe allowed those people to get closer to what iptiQ were really trying to achieve. And I firmly believe that even as a second line risk function, you can't identify what the real risks are if you are too closed off, if you're in your ivory tower. And being close, of course, to the business and being objective is a very careful balance to be struck. But frankly, distance from what the business is doing will tend to make your enabling approach far more conservative because the unknown always creates fear. So once we moved out of that initial build phase for iptiQ, I dissolved the control tribe as a central body, and those requirements instead became integrated into the wider domains and delivery teams as part of BAU. One of the really interesting cultural challenges in iptiQ is that we have to balance this innovation and regulation. We hire, motivated, smart, creative people into the UX team, into the marketing teams, into the tech team. And I really had to balance not wanting to crush that fresh creativity with the balance that we are still a highly regulated insurance company. And the fact is, to be truly innovative, you are always going to be one step ahead of regulation, in that it's not the job of regulators to account for all possible, future developments that insurtechs could have. So I think to navigate that transparency is just absolutely fundamental. And exploring together from that design phase, what is the sandbox that we can play in remains really important in iptiQ.
I think when I look back, we spent too much time going round and round on making some decisions about how we really got going. For me, the key learning is you can get a really bunch of smart people together in a room, create a concept, a plan and an architecture, but you need people who've executed and have delivered before. Progress isn't always neat and tidy and mistakes will always be made along the way. Too many large corporations fall into the trap of having a perfect plan, a thorough analysis, and above all want demand certainty and success. This isn't how the real world works. Real progress is messy and difficult. We're dealing with emergent complexity. It cannot be controlled and boxed in despite what we wish. I have to confess, some of the agile and DevOps evangelism that Victoria mentioned was coming from me. I think I was overly scared that the big traditional corporate culture would be too strong and overwhelm us, which is why I think I pushed so hard on the concept of agile and DevOps. Ultimately, the principles are more important than the practices, and I think sometimes I lost sight of this. I was trying so hard to make success of this business. But for me, this is part of the learning and improving, both personally and as a learning organisation.
There were many eyes were watching. And even with a small internal launch, we didn't want to damage our credibility before we'd actually built any. So we sat in our executive team meeting and officially approved the go live. And luckily, we had a willing Munich employee over in Zurich who became our first official customer. And I think his photo is actually sort of in our customer care center as a sort of mini shrine. Watching the traffic on Slack pick up with numerous warnings from the tech developers to not touch anything in production, and then this explosion of celebration on Slack when there was a confirmed payment and that a policy had actually been generated in our backend. That was really the first time that I realized what digital truly means. You know, the sheer machine that's needed to power it in the back end versus I could have just printed off a policy and asked Stefano, our colleague, to sign it there and then. So in order to continue iptiQ's successful journey in 2019, it became very clear that an emphasis on an internal model ramp up was needed and a move away from an outsourced expertise model. And it's been and it continues to be about building both our platform and people capabilities. And people in Swiss Re often ask, you know, when they see what we're doing, is it too much too soon? But in a large corporate, it'll always be too much. You know, there's always a balance between focusing on back-end constraints, not creating legacy, but keeping your front end flexible and opportunistic for new partners. And in the middle, making sure that management stretch is really equal. And that is the inherent complexity of a B2B2C business model. You need to have an agnostic platform to be scalable, but enough capabilities to be tailorable. So we also continued to grow the team quite a lot in 2019, particularly on the technology side. Very unusually for an insurer, the vast majority of our internal headcount are technology developers and engineers. They're not insurance agents. And also with, to be honest, an overall demographic of a far younger age group than you might otherwise see in traditional financial services. Having such a huge volume of developers definitely raised a few eyebrows within Swiss Re, particularly before you've even launched your first partnership. But it's so needed from a platform build perspective to ensure that longevity and not create legacy. So 2019 was also the year that iptiQ won the DIA 100 Top InsurTechs Awards. And most excitingly, in November, the combined global iptiQ brand was officially given unicorn status.
So as Victoria mentioned, our first partner delivery was with Allthings, and that launch came only 3 months after our initial friends and family launch in April. Allthings are a European prop tech ecosystem platform who provide an app to tenants all over Europe for them to access an extensive range of complementary services to living in one of their properties. For example, rental deposit, maintenance services, laundry, and even bread orders. And they want to partner with iptiQ to provide insurance services on their platform. This is a completely different way of working for Swiss Re. Allthings didn't have an extensive resources and capacity. We were just another platform participant to them. This meant we did the majority of our interaction via Slack and engineer to engineer with a brief weekly call. But ultimately, we had to figure it all out. It was amazing to see our proposition and brand come together with theirs and really test our white labeling capabilities for the first time. I think the team did an amazing job and allowed us to practice and learn for the bigger fish that were coming down the road. The Reese felt like the first real time we began to grow into our own skins as a real business with a real identity who could achieve anything we wanted if we just put our minds to it. The buzz of going this live this time felt even more of a high for me, and I felt a mixture of emotions because I knew that I achieved what I set out to do. I'd been on the founding team and helped build a digital insurer from the ground up. There was no instruction manual, we'd done this on ourselves, and we'd given our all to this endeavour and been successful. It still makes my hair stand on end when I talk about it.
Now, at the small team level, there's two other organizational capabilities that manifest almost organically if you have these first two, which are this concept of empowered execution, which means very simply people tend to know their roles and responsibilities, and they're empowered to basically make decisions inside of a framework that's been pre-established by the organization. And they tend to understand what each other are thinking. And so we call this shared consciousness, where there's almost an emergent intelligence that's created by a high density of interactions and radical transparency. And it's this component that we found to be pretty important as you think about scaling this across the organization. Because in most experiences that we've been in, if you have a small elite team, whether it's in my old world or in the business world, what tends to happen is you tend to grow it. Because you say, well, this thing's having success. Let's do more of it. And so all of a sudden, this small team starts to get bigger. It becomes a little bit tougher to manage. It becomes more unruly. And pretty soon, because we want to make it efficient, we start organizing it into logical structures that are easier to understand. And pretty soon, the very thing that made us sort of fast, nimble, and agile gets assumed into what would be a modern day org structure for almost any organization on the planet. Now, if you've done this well, and you look at any individual team inside of the structure, you probably find a nimble, agile team. At least hopefully you would. But at an enterprise level, you've clearly lost something. And if we look at our 4 organizational capabilities, what we believe by design is that shared consciousness is the first thing that's compromised. And it makes sense, right? I mean, the whole reason why you structured this was that you wanted to silo off distractions from different teams so they could focus on their specific goals and objectives and not waste time on other things. But in this new complex world where everything's interdependent, we found that to be a decisively limiting factor that it created tremendous risk, both for ourselves and for organizations as things adapted and changed. And it has a compounding effect, obviously, on the other 3 components, right? So if I'm siloed off now, it's very easy to get misaligned on what goals and objectives are, at least for the enterprise level. Trust starts to break down because you just have less visibility in what people are doing. And then inevitably leadership gets involved and starts pulling decision-making space up to their level. So empowerment starts to detract. So it has this compounding effect on all 3. Really what this became was leading beyond the org chart, because if you go back and remember the organizations that, populated this task force, none of those we had the ability to actually change structures and even roles and responsibilities. Everything was more or less a handshake deal. So we had to find a way to work beyond the confines of like an org chart and based on needs that were changing rapidly, much faster than you could say, get something approved through, let's say, Congress, for instance, on driving change. And last is this model of radical transparency that was a byproduct of creating these communication mechanisms, gave organizations and specifically leaders the ability to feel much more comfortable with letting people run and empower them to operate at the local level. The basic thesis here was the person closest to the problem is best situated to solve the problem. So leadership's role really became about making the network sort of function effectively, and they could have the confidence in doing that by the accountability that was created from the transparency of the operating mechanism. So it allowed leaders to take this eyes-on, hands-off approach to leading the organization. So if you're trying to figure out how to actually make this work inside of your organization, there's really 2 levers that you kind of have to pull almost simultaneously. So the first is process and technology, because I grouped those 2 things together. Most technology exists to support or improve processes. And then you're obviously your people, because we are talking about organization. So let's talk about process first. For us, the first thing that we did when we got overseas is we redefined our daily battle rhythm or our operating rhythm. And the goal here was to say, all right, in a 24-hour cycle, we need to do operations. We need to then process the information that we collect from the operations. We then need to feed that into a shared learning mechanism, which in this case was called the Ops and Intelligence Update, which was a 90-minute meeting that took place every day across more than 15,000 people in 27 countries. That then led into small team-based planning sessions, which then resulted in them executing operations, and we repeat this cycle every single day. 24 hours and 7. And if you looked at this, what it did was it connected the enterprise and all those different components of it, in this case, the CIA, the NSA, the operators, all into one collective. So now, instead of these handoffs, we were bringing them in for this more or less scrum of scrums, the Ops Intelligence Update, where we were cross-leveling in real-time information and then able to figure out what we need to do differently the next night, and then we could harness them. Also, it energized and activated people 3 or 4 layers down the organization to be able to figure out how to horse trade both assets, resources, or information to unlock productivity across the system. And this had tremendous effects in the organization. So we put this new operating model in place, the CrossLead framework, more or less. And by August of 2006, what was 18 raids jumped up to 300 raids, which is basically now 10 every night across this task force. Roughly the same number of operators, definitely better technology and capabilities, but you can see we democratized the decision-making and exploded the productivity that we had in the organization. And the results were pretty impressive. We went from a network that we were having a really hard time getting our hands around to starting to take this Al-Qaeda in Iraq, isolate it into individual factions, and then start beating on it on a nightly basis until it became more or less suppressed. And by the time we got to 2008, 2009, we would say that the threat was more or less in remission. This had decisive effects for us and really changed fundamentally how we thought about leading and managing, which is what we're here to talk about today. And so as we've applied this to businesses, what we've seen is dramatic increases in productivity and predictability on your outcomes, because you're consistently emerging and evolving on, leveraging this agile best practices that are applied at the enterprise level. You usually see much improved results with your customer satisfaction. And obviously, the whole goal of this is get every single employee engaged in the process, because we believe that in this new environment, every individual is effectively a leader.
I hope you enjoy these excerpts and that you learned something from it. Since 2014, we've run 10 conferences in the US and the UK. And each year, our goal is to create programming that is even better than the previous year. You're going to hear exciting experience reports from executives from Adidas, Swiss Re, Nationwide Building Society, Lufthansa, and so many more. I'm also so excited that we will have speaking Peter Moore, Dr. Carlotta Perez, John Alspaugh, Dr. Stephen Spear, who will teach us about one of the most interesting historical examples of creating a rapid learning dynamic. If you want to see these talks right away, the only way you can get them is by registering. For a variety of reasons, we will not be able to make these talks public until later this year. You can see the entirety of these talks and so much more at our first virtual DevOps Enterprise Summit, which is being held on June 23rd to 25th, being held during London summertime. Again, I'm so excited about the unique learning experience that we've created for you, and I hope to see you there on June 23rd.